Well, howdy everyone, and today I'm looking at probably the most expensive camera lens I've ever reviewed, the Canon 50mm f1.2 USM L. I'm going to test it on a full-frame camera where 50mm is a really nice focal length, giving you plenty of emphasis on your subject, but also a wide and potentially very blurry background. Later in the review, I'll also test it on my APS-C camera, a Canon 60D, where it acts like an 80mm lens, so it could be potentially awesome for shooting portraits. This lens came out in 2006 as a replacement to Canon's long discontinued and extremely expensive 50mm f1.0 lens. The selling point is obviously its extremely wide maximum aperture of f1.2. Look at all that glass. This thing can let in a lot of light. It's extremely useful for shooting indoors or in any other dark place, being especially fantastic for video work at night. The other advantage of an exceptionally wide aperture is that you can get a very narrow depth of field or blurry background. This potentially makes the Canon 50mm f1.2 an extremely creative lens. The lens is very solidly built. It's a pleasure to hold in your hand, although it is pretty big and heavy. It's a simple lens, but you can tell it's a very professional product. There's even a gasket on the back of the lens to keep dust or splashes of water out of your camera, so if you put a filter on the front, then the lens would be weather sealed. The focus ring is very smooth and well damped, as you'd imagine from a Canon L lens. As you can see in this video, focus pulling is very easy with this lens. You can also see in this video that the lens is not image stabilized. The lens's USM autofocus motor doesn't give the fastest autofocus in the world, probably because of the sheer amount of glass it has to move around, but thankfully it is virtually silent in use. The autofocus accuracy was fairly good in my tests, even at f1.2, which is impressive as the depth of field is so narrow. Overall, the lens is built very nicely indeed, definitely up to Canon's high L lens standards. Let's look at the image quality. We'll start by testing it on one of Canon's expensive full-frame cameras, a 20-megapixel Canon 6D. Let's look closely at the middle of the image when the aperture is wide open at f1.2. This is really the most important result, as most people will be buying this lens specifically because it can reach this super wide aperture. The image is fairly sharp, but there's some ghosting and strong purple fringing, which is a real shame. If we look over in the corners, the image is quite soft, and there are hints of chromatic aberration or weird colours on contrasting edges. That shouldn't really be surprising for any lens at f1.2, but it's still a bit disappointing. Stop the lens down to f1.8 and it's a little better in the corners, but still fairly soft. However, the picture quality in the middle has really cleared up, becoming very sharp and contrasty. Stop down again to f2.8 for a perfect image in the middle, and corners that are acceptably sharp. The corners see a big increase in sharpness at f4, and they look fantastic at f5.6, although there are still hints of chromatic aberration visible. The lens now remains super sharp, even when the aperture is topped all the way down to f16. So, on a full-frame camera, the lens technically struggles at f1.2, although there is some sharpness in the middle. It's actually quite usable in reality, just not very impressive. Okay, let's take a look at the lens's performance on one of Canon's far more popular and less expensive APS-C cameras, in this case my 18-megapixel Canon 60D. As you can see, the smaller APS-C sensor gives you a more zoomed-in picture, the equivalent of 80mm. With the aperture wide open again at f1.2, in the middle of the image we can see a good amount of sharpness, but again, we can also see a lot of ghosting and purple fringing, for example in these window frames. When we look over in the corners, we can see that the lens is only a bit softer, not quite as bad as the full frame corners. Chromatic aberration is a bit more noticeable on an APS-C camera. Stop down to f1.8 and the picture is a lot sharper and punchier, although the chromatic aberration remains. When we look back in the middle, the picture quality looks fantastic with excellent colours and contrast. At f2.8, the picture quality is stunning in the middle, and the corners are very sharp indeed. At f5.6, the image is as good as it's going to get. It stays very sharp all the way down to f16 when there's a slight drop in sharpness due to the effect of diffraction. So on an APS-C camera, the lens is a bit sharper in the corners, but you get stronger chromatic aberration and purple fringing. At f1.2 there is some sharpness, but you'd hope the picture quality might be better. But image sharpness isn't everything, and there are a few other optical issues to look at. As you can see in these pictures, there's some fairly moderate barrel distortion when you use a full-frame camera, and you can also see some pretty huge vignetting or dark corners at f1.2. If you switch on peripheral illumination on your camera, then it's greatly reduced at a cost of lower picture quality in the corners. It's not a great performance, but thankfully it's nowhere near as bad on an APS-C camera. The lens can focus down to 45 centimeters, which isn't particularly close. As you can see here, the close-up image quality at f1.2 is pretty soft, which is disappointing. But there's a good improvement at f2, and it becomes very sharp at f2.8. But essentially, you definitely don't want to use this lens for macro work. A piece of good news is that, as you can see here, the lens handles bright lights quite well, with not too much lack of contrast. The only problem comes when you point it directly at the sun, which is a pretty silly thing to do anyway. Another really positive attribute is that the lens has a nice quality background blur, or bokeh. It's really smooth looking, with backgrounds just melting away. Canon's other 50mm lenses often have slightly harsh or distracting bokeh, so this is really an important and positive feature. So, overall, what can we say? Despite its huge price tag of over £1,000 or around $1,500 US, the Canon 50mm f1.2 USM is a surprisingly average lens in many ways, except for its great maximum aperture. The real brownie points come when you look at the lens's nice build quality, its ability to get usable pictures at f1.2, and its nice quality bokeh, which is above average for this kind of lens. Everything else is pretty run-of-the-mill. This lens could be a favourite of wedding photographers and other professionals who need f1.2 or rugged build quality. But being over £1,000, Canon have priced out virtually everyone else. A lot of people might be wondering, how does it compare to the much cheaper Canon 50mm f1.4? Well, soon I'll post a handy comparison video for you and put a link for you here. The Canon 50mm f1.2 L may not be an excellent lens, nor particularly good value, but its unique abilities certainly make it a dream lens for a lot of photographers.